Welcome back to the Group Practice Accelerator podcast, brought to you by Polaris Healthcare Partners, where we leverage decades of healthcare and business experience to drive growth in successful group practices just like yours. If you're a healthcare entrepreneur and you're interested in building, scaling, or exiting your group practice, you've found not only the industry's leading resource for business education, but a team of trusted advisors dedicated to helping you achieve and exceed your goals. In short, the team at Polaris creates clarity, confidence, and results. I'm your host, Jamie Falash, and the Group Practice Accelerator podcast is on the air. Hey everyone, thanks again for joining me today for another episode. And as you heard in last week's podcast, when I had Kyle Webster behind the mic with me, we got into a conversation about the heating M&A market and what that means for sellers. So now, understanding there's a lot to consider when you're going to market, we wanted to balance things out. So today, we thought we'd shift gears a bit and talk about something a little bit different, a different kind of transaction, and that's the cap table merger or partnerships. And then before we close out the episode, we'll get into buy-side considerations as well. Well, I'm not going to tackle that one on my own when I've got resident experts here in the house. So please let me welcome my teammate and Polaris expert and Executive and Partnership Consultant, Mark Flock. Mark, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be back. Thanks, Jamie.
Well, great. Why don't we just get right into it today? And I know we're talking about cap table mergers, meaning partnerships between independent, successful businesses coming together to form a new company. And I know sometimes we see this as, a geographic play, or sometimes it's a multi-specialty move, but the obvious goal being to create a larger, more valuable organization. Can you expand on that and start with some basics for our newer listeners, and maybe begin by defining exactly what a cap table merger or partnership is and what it's not?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jamie. And clients that are probably considering these options for many different reasons. And it could be, synergies, people that you're referring business to today with different specialties. It could be you have a colleague, or not say a colleague, or maybe someone in the area that you went to dental school with that's also maybe a GP. If you're also a GP, you might have 3 to 5 locations. They might have 2 to 4 locations. And you might say, hey, you know what? It's tough to grow alone and continue doing this by myself. What if we merge together and form a partnership and take what was maybe 5 and 4 locations respectively to a 9 location business and proceed forward that way? There's a lot of economics that go in through it, which is why it's important. There's also a lot of legal considerations, tax considerations. There's a lot of different things. So it's complicated, but that's why we help clients through the entire process based on experience. And trying to do that all yourself can be very taxing, no pun intended, with the taxes that might be involved in certain aspects. So that's kind of the general process. And I can kind of go through, if you'd like, Jamie, some benefits, some maybe, some cons or drawbacks in doing so, because it is completely different than what you have today. And it'll look and feel completely different than what you have today. But there's a lot of reasons why doctors are considering it. And it's, like I said, having partners to grow with, we can get into it if you'd like, but that's kind of what essentially it's going into. And it doesn't have to be 5 and 4. It can be 2 and 2, or locations. It can be 1 location and 6 locations. I have a couple where it's 6, 8, and 5 respectively. 3 coming together. 3 different partners kind of coming together and bringing all their small group together to form a larger group. And that's kind of what a partnership merger would be from a general sense. Yeah.
Definitely. And that can be just a mixed bag of literally any kind of combination that you think of, I'm sure. But before we get into what some of that could look like, let's kind of drill down into the synergies that you mentioned. You mentioned consolidation of administrative expenses. Let's look at maybe the economic side of it. Can you elaborate on that a bit for our listeners, please?
Yeah, that's a great question, and kind of bringing up some key points that we'll want to talk about is obviously maybe a reason to doing it is the synergy aspect to it. So as long as if it's 3 partners coming together to form a partnership, or if it's 2 or it's 5, like we've seen, 5 or 6 potentially that we've seen coming together, you kind of want to make sure that you see yourself working with all those individuals. You're now a partner bound to those individuals, and you want to make sure you agree with their business philosophy, maybe slightly on the end goal or the exit strategy. Some partners might be, hey, I'm not looking to exit for another 15 years. I have 15 years to go. Or the other one's like, hey, I want out in 2 or 3. Not a problem. You can still form a partnership and kind of go through that process, but you want to know those things going into it. You don't want to find out after the fact and how to unravel certain aspects, which is completely doable. It's why step into certain things if you plan on exiting in 6 months for one of those partners. It's like just leave that off to the side, for the time being.
Exactly.
Um,
Hey, guys, I'm leaving in a year, and now we've got to unwind all of this legally, which is super expensive. So let's try to avoid those traps, right?
and that's where give us a call and we can kind of talk through what that looks like. And if someone says 3 years, that's not a problem. But if it's 6 months, like it's not worth the hassle, in my opinion, at least. And then synergies, we see a lot of like referral partners potentially, or hey, we're there might be some competitive aspects, and let's just come together and have a more synergistic relationship. I have some groups that are, pedo, ortho, oral surgery that are coming together. It just kind of depends. I mean, I'm sure you've seen a lot in the industry as far as the listeners of combining specialties together, maybe under one roof. Well, you can do that with your practice that might be specific. Let's say you're an orthodontic group and you're also working and having a referral partner on the pedo side or pediatric side of things, and just coming together and kind of just creating that flow of business all under one roof together. And then, yes, the consolidation of administrative expenses. You don't need 3 COOs potentially. You don't need potentially 3 call centers if you want to create a call center. You have a lot of redundant administrative expenses that you can consolidate, and you can also streamline that at the parent organization to flow down to each of the 15 or 5 locations that you have. So that's where you're creating more of a economies of scale aspect to it. So that way you're able to lower some of your expenses on the administrative side, but then now you have potentially more buying power with respect to, so if you have with respect to supplies, it might be marketing, it might help simplify things, insurances and insurance reimbursement rates if you're taking plans versus everything being maybe fee for service. So you now, let's just say you're sending out $500,000 to a PPO plan. Well, now as a group, you might be sending out 3 million. Well, that gives you a little bit more power to negotiate rates and reimbursement rates and for your fee schedules and things like that. So the same goes with supplies. You might be buying with either Shine, Benco, Patterson, or Darby, whoever you're working with. You might have about $500,000 a year, or maybe even $1 million a year in a supply expense. Well, now if you have $4 million, you might be talking about creating a formulary, which is going to help lower your cost potentially, streamline things, and you can now push it out to all of the locations depending on what they buy. And so and then marketing, obviously, when you spread it out all over 15 locations versus 5, it feels like a smaller hit potentially at each location versus having a market for one and then start everything for marketing for a second one and for a third one. Well, now it's all under one roof, and the cost per location will typically be less depending on what you're doing. So,
Well, what a powerful thing to bring all of that under one roof, as you called it. I was just talking to one of our clinical coaches, Vivek Solanki, last week or the week prior on the podcast, and we were talking about what that can mean, not just from an economic perspective, but for the practice in general, for your patients, for staff, and that can be just really powerful in growing your bottom line as well, of course. And speaking of that, can you touch on EBITDA aggregation, please? I mean, not too much math here. That could be a lot. This is a long conversation. So
yeah,
I'll let
it
you from there.
that's another reason why some practices or clients will do it. I wouldn't solely do it just for that. And when you say EBITDA aggregation, if you think about it, if each practice owner is bringing $1 million in EBITDA to the table, and there's 5 of them, well, if you go to market with a $1 million small group practice, you're going to get a multiple for that. Just throw out an arbitrary number at maybe 6x, for that. But if you have 5 partners and you have a business that's truly operating as a group all together with all 5 businesses, and it's tied together and tethered with all the correct, service agreements and things like that, you now have a $5 million EBITDA business as a whole. And let's just say you get a 10x multiple for that, you've actually increased the value of your equity, even though you've gone from 100% partner of a $1 million business valued at 6x to maybe now a 20% partner of a business that's now valued at, it would be, 5 million at 10x, $50 million versus $6 million. You're actually gaining value on your overall equity that you own, even though you're kind of sliding backwards with respect to the percentage of equity that you own. So that's an opportunity there. It needs to be structured correctly. It can't be, I mean, there's a term that was thrown out 3 or 4 years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, duct tape DSO.
I've
That's
heard it.
that it's if you try to do it yourself, that's what you could possibly get. And then if you try to go to market and you have 15 locations and you realize when you get an offer, it's valued as 15 separate locations at a lower multiple, if not done correctly. So that's why it's extremely important to go through the process, hire a firm, like Polaris, work with the right attorney that understands the consolidation of this, as well as work with your CPA or CPAs to understand the tax aspect and how to the bookkeeping that goes with it. Because it's not a quick transition. It's
Mm.
very much a process, but once it's done and it's operating the way it should and it's legally set up the way it should, it can be very rewarding once you move forward there. And the nice thing about it is, from a debt perspective, you now have more buying power from a debt perspective. If you want to accumulate more locations faster or expand faster or do de novos, you now have a bigger business for a financial partner to kind of grow. The same goes with associates. Not to kind of get too many, it's you now have more opportunity for associates. So associates can have a feel of a bigger organization with the opportunities for that you can give them for advancement, for clinical hours work, so they can increase their collections numbers and get paid more, but also have that small kind of business feel a little bit. So it's kind of the best of both worlds there a little bit, if done correctly, having that small practice vibe, but also having the more opportunity like a private equity firm or a larger DSO. So I went through a lot there, but hopefully that answered your question.
It definitely did. Thank you. Okay, so my next question, I've heard this before. Can this also be used as a defensive strategy? Like if you're wanting to operate long term, maybe exit a little further down the road, meaning maybe 10 years.
Yeah, great question, Jamie. And some people don't think about that as a way of doing this, but yes, absolutely. If you think about it for all the reasons I just mentioned, even if you're just looking to build this and maintain it for 15, 20 years, it can absolutely be defensive with respect to competing against a larger DSOs, competing against rising costs of things, because you're getting those economies of scale. You have partners to help you through the process. You have a bigger business that can support times of financial issues versus it solely being on your shoulders. You have people to kind of help out throughout the process. So it can absolutely be a defensive strategy in the marketplace as long as you're willing to have partners, in the mix, and you're not necessarily wanting to be the sole owner for the rest of your life and have full control and being able to do so.
Yeah, and that kind of brings me back to something you said before about partners, which is a great segue into what I want to ask you next. Having partners comes with a lot. It can. You need to know yourself well enough. But let's talk about the drawbacks. You're no longer the 100% owner, like you mentioned before. What are some of the other drawbacks of having partners?
That's a big one. Jamie kind of hit the nail on the head. So if you're wanting to be in control and be the one making all decisions, forming a partnership may eliminate that ability to do so. It doesn't have to. So when forming these partnership mergers, if you're bringing the bulk of equity into the overall group, you may remain in 50% plus of the overall equity in the group itself, which would still, if you're at 51% or more, you still have majority control and you can still kind of make those majority decisions. You'll most likely not have super majority control, which is at a higher percentage. But if you struggle with sharing the decision making process with other people or being able to solely make that decision yourself, this might not be the right option for you. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just you have to be okay with that. And that's why I say having those partners that you're combining forces with is key, and kind of being on the same page is extremely important. Those values that you all share, if they're not aligned, then I wouldn't go through this process.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Like if you are somebody that really needs to be in the driver's seat on everything and making those joint decisions isn't going to work for you, I mean, it's up to you to know yourself well enough before you get into this. But that said, there are some great partners to work with out there that can be hugely beneficial. So, something to consider. And talk about balance in partnership. Can you touch on buying up, selling down to better equalize that partnership?
Yeah, that's absolutely an option. That I kind of, well, I was going to mention that earlier, but thanks for bringing that up, Jamie. Is that just because what you have converts to say 30% and another partner has converts to 40%, and then another partner brings to the table, converts to the other 30% in the overall group, doesn't mean you can't equalize or level it out. There'll just be possibly an exchange of cash or personal loans typically at the time of transitioning and forming the partnership from the financing aspect that you would do. So you may, in this case, buy up 3.3%. The other 30% partner might buy the other 3.3%, and the 40% partner would be selling 6.6%, kind of in that example,
Right.
and be getting a cash out type opportunity. But then it equalizes the cap table to a third, a third, a third, and that's 100% doable. That's part of the process of like where I have to step in and facilitate, because it doesn't have to be just raw equity that you're bringing to the table in the partnership, which a lot of times it is. That's how it is. But there might be some small buy ups or sell downs to kind of give some people an opportunity. This is where also an associate that's wanting to buy equity, if we're converting things, they might buy in for say 5%, and they would take out a loan to do so. And that would come at one partner's or all pro rata at their
Mhm.
expense, but then you can do all that at the same time. It's very simple because evaluations are completed. You have financing in the mix. It's just easier and simpler to do it all at once. And it's more
Yeah.
cost effective, quite frankly.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. All right. Let's talk about debt consolidation because this was on the list of things that you and I spoke about once in terms of maybe a drawback. But I'm going to let you expand on it. Understanding, debt obviously can't be reassigned, meaning it's the obligation of whoever personally guaranteed it. And we know in a merger that we're bringing all these things together and it either needs to be, combined, recapitalized under the new entity, or it has to be paid off at the point of the merger, which, I mean, that has to be tough, right?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways you can do this, Jamie. So the owners of that debt can pay it off, and that
Mhm.
will potentially change their equity stance in the practice because they're not necessarily rolling it to the partnership. However, it's most common, depending on the debt loads that each of the owners have, is that it would need to be refinanced and then housed at the DSO or group level. Some people don't like the word term DSO. It's more of a legal term than anything. But at the parent level or the high level, it's everything gets refinance there essentially. And then
Mhm.
depending on what the group's need is, we would go through the process of trying to facilitate all of that, put them in the right structure for that, review all the bank packages that go through it and all the loan covenants, because a lot of times the structure of that debt is more important than essentially the cost that you're paying for it. And a lot of clients don't realize that. It's like, oh, my rates, I'm going from 3.5% rates that I got 4 years ago or 5 years ago because it was crazy during COVID and coming out of COVID, and now I got to refinance at 6.5%. It doesn't make sense. But if you're able to do all that and you're still able to write off the interest aspect to it from a tax perspective, but and also get a growth facility or guidance line that's going to give the ability to buy or start 1 to 2 locations a year if that's your strategy. If it's not, that's fine. But depending on your growth strategy, what is that opportunity cost of not being able to do that? If you're able to acquire, say, two businesses that are doing a $1 million in revenue each or in collections that has a 20% or a $200,000 in EBITDA, you're missing out on $200,000 to $400,000 in EBITDA a year to fight over maybe 20, 30,000, maybe even 40,000 at best, and an interest expense difference but you're missing out on that opportunity. And if you can grow those businesses, you're missing out on, just call it $200,000 to $400,000 and those acquisition costs that you're getting as far as a benefit to dwell on, maybe a 10, 20, $30,000 in interest, depending on the rate difference. So there's an opportunity cost that you kind of have to consider. And a lot of clients struggle with that. And I completely get it. You see 3.5, you see 6.5. I would too if I was buying a home. It's different than buying a home though. That's different than buying businesses and growing value with the EBITDA. That's reoccurring every year. Whereas you're paying off a loan, it's done, after a certain period of time. So that's something that people sometimes get hung up on and where that debt goes. So when you're dealing with that, you really need to I need to really work with CPAs to understand what, has been claimed as depreciation at this point, what has been deemed as far as amortization if you purchased a business, what has been written off personally for those owners at that location. Because if you transfer assets, that could create a taxable event. We need to understand what that is prior to doing so. So that's kind of getting into the accounting side of things, but that's also very important. So it's not just, hey, I want to build this and let's go form a company and have an attorney throw this all together. There's a lot more to it. And we want to know at each stage what it's going to cause, if anything, before executing it and then realizing you have a big obligation the next year because you did it incorrectly. Yeah. There's always an option to push through. It's just a matter of what that is and what that burden may or may not be.
Sure. Well, and speaking of accounting, obviously there's going to be a new accounting structure. So let's maybe roll it into, can you touch on fees, accounting, attorneys, that kind of thing? That's going to change.
Yeah, typically outside of the Polaris fees, it's usually just a accounting, meaning CPA. They're going to have to weigh in on some of this process. And then the really ongoing cost is the accounting moving forward. There's an extra set of books. Have a group practice set up where you merged everything together. You'll probably want to consolidate all down to one CPA or accounting firm versus having three separate. If it's three partners coming together, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do so. It's all under one house. So you have a little bit of added expense there moving forward. And then you most likely have a service agreement. So you need to get that in place and tweak that a little bit early on. And that'll be something that an accountant can kind of help out along with Polaris and the process. And the attorney fees, I can't really speak to the actual numbers. It all depends on scope of work. Same goes for accounting. So I can't quote what a CPA would charge or what an attorney would charge, because if you have a lot of operating agreements to amend at the practice levels, if you need to change structures because you may have an S corp, you need to convert to an LLC, there's things like that. If you need we obviously need to create the operating agreement at the group level, make sure everyone's on the same page there and review everything. If we're creating a master service agreement, there's little things that need to be added. There's a handful of attorneys out there that will try to do things at a fixed cost, so you can kind of budget it once they understand the full scope of work. And then there's hourly rates that you can kind of talk through, but they're definitely needed throughout the process. And then the banking piece, that's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, you're going to have potentially, some costs to maybe close on a loan or update the loan for that matter. And then the ongoing principal and interest payment.
Sure. Well, and for our listeners, we've got some great attorney and accounting partners here. So if you need that, please reach out to us. We can help you get you set up there. But, the last drawback that I want to touch on, what about the time commitment? You mentioned earlier that this is a lengthy process.
Yeah, it's at best it's 6 months, and I would never promise that to kind of go from start to finish, because really, when we get engaged, we're going through and running full detailed evaluations on every single location, every single partner, looking at the debt balances that each have that are bringing to the table, going through the before and after view of things, discussing that process and making sure all partners are in agreement. Sometimes there might be one partner that gets to the 10th hour and says, hey, this isn't right for me. So it changes the cap table or capitalization table, and everyone's equity changes as a percentage. When you're dropping one business, everyone grows as a percentage, but the overall value is now less, collectively as a whole. So a lot of things that kind of go through there. I would say it's usually a 8 or 9 month process, depending on the financing aspect, because that's where, banks and financial institutions, once we get started there, can kind of be the I want to say Achilles heel on timing, depending on how fast they are and where you're at and when that process gets started. But it's usually about an 8 or 9 process. I'd say give or take a month or two. It just depends. no different than when I do equity models, depending on the situation with partnerships and how complex they may be. It can usually vary a month in some cases. So if you don't want to go through that process, you're not committed to that process, then by all means don't engage until you're ready. But it can be very rewarding if done correctly and move forward. And we have a lot of clients that go through that and appreciate it once they get to the other side. But I help guide them through the process. I'm the quarterback and coach, and
We
they're all
know.
my play. They're all my players, and they're all my players kind of in there executing. But I'm guiding them along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's picking things off with the right financial modeling for each organization. That's a foundational piece and a tool for our clients as well, of course.
It's
But
extremely important. It's extremely important that the financial modeling is detailed and correct because we don't want to mess up someone's equity percentages by a percentage or two because it can mean a lot to that person 10, 15 years down the road, depending on what you build. Yep. So we got to get it done right the first time.
sure, absolutely. So briefly here, I want to shift gears and talk through buy side, meaning, okay, I'm a successful doc. I have a successful group or practice, and I want to buy a location or maybe more than one. Aside from the obvious fact that I want to expand, what do I need to be thinking of in terms of buy side?
There's 1,000 things that people don't always think
Come
about
on, Mark.
sometimes, it depends on the situation. How well do you
Yeah.
know the seller? Have you met the staff? It's extremely important. A lot of times I hear clients going into this, I've never met the staff. No one's willing to allow me to meet the staff. If
Oh,
I'm buying a business, and one of the major drawbacks in buying a business is culture expectations outside of the economics. Like I want to make sure the employees that are there are one ideally staying if I want them to, but also that they're going to be a fit for my vision, my mission, my expectations as either a group practice or seeing everything long term with me. So you kind of have to ask yourself, why am I buying it? It's a great question. It's a very basic question, but why am I buying it? Disregard the price that you're paying or the price that's being solicited at, but why do I want this location? Is it the location? Is it the patient base? Is it a growing demographics? Does it fit what my practice is doing, or is it a complete opposite? So if you're all fee for service on your 5 locations, and this is an insurance or PPO practice, or even even I would say even worse, but even completely different, like a Medicaid office,
oh
why am
yeah.
I buying that Medicaid office? Doesn't mean you shouldn't buy it. It's just, does it fit, and am I aware of what I'm getting into, and how different that may be with what I'm used to? So there's a lot of things to consider there, and I'm always looking at what are the effects post transition. So yes, we go through the economics and we do an evaluation and we help work with the doctor on when we're representing the buyer on the LOI and going through the process and all the different considerations that go into it, and kind of showing what it's worth to you as a buyer, not what the seller necessarily thinks it's worth to them. So that's two different things. And sometimes those lines are too far apart. And if we're close, there's usually a deal to be made. But it's looking at those post transition effects. Is the seller staying on? If so, how long? What does that contract look like? Do they plan on working indefinitely? I have one right now where the seller just does not necessarily want to be a practice owner. It's just stressed out from practice ownerships, but a
Okay.
very, 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 very good clinician. And my buyer loves the fact of how good of a clinician he is, knows him personally, and they have another 15 years or so runway and doesn't want to say let it go. So in this case, it's considering what they call an equity roll, where it's taking some of that purchase price that's being, and our buyer is going to essentially bring less to the table up front, but then roll the difference in equity into their business so they can have a bite of the apple throughout the process. But this seller is going to stay on and help them grow, because he can't do it himself, doesn't want to have all the responsibility. My client has already mastered all of that, enjoys that aspect of it, really good at that aspect of it, and knows how to, take this business from, let's just say, $1 million in revenue to 225 in a quick manner with the seller, just in a different capacity. So understanding what the post transition effects will be, positive and negative. And like I said, I mentioned equity roll. That's part of the process we go through if it makes sense. The really important thing is you need someone to represent your best interest. And that's why this is, a pretty popular, I would say, growing service for our clients and buyers in the industry is that the seller almost always or most of the time has someone representing them. Yeah, in the process, usually a broker or someone who's done an evaluation with their lens. And you kind of need to come in and someone to represent you and make sure you're making the right decision, not just economically, but everything I mentioned up to this point, asking a lot of questions, ironing a lot of things out, and making sure this makes sense for you. Not just are you buying it at the right price, which is important, but are you structuring it in the right way based on your growth strategy? And is the seller interested in that and excited about that? If so, I think there's a good opportunity here. Because price, yes, it's important. You're kind of limited to what the bank will finance it for. But if you overpay by 50,000, but you build it to so much more and create $50,000 additional in EBITDA than what you expected, to me, that's a great deal because now you have $50,000 extra per year for the next however many years, and is helping to add to your multiple when you do decide to exit. So it's actually a much better, like worry less about the price sometimes, but the structure is extremely important and what you're going to get out of it.
Well, sure. And just having access to that practice and really getting to know them to make sure that they're a good fit might not seem initially like an economic consideration, but it 100% is because down the road, let's say you have, some people that end up being roadblocks in your practice, that can really impact the growth of the business over time. So knowing that you can make changes if necessary, all of it comes down to that economic impact. Can you see yourself working with these people? Can you not see yourself working with these people? But knowing what you're getting into ahead of time, getting the right people to represent you, like you, who does a wonderful job at this. And again, is it the right price? Thinking of the long game, of course. All right. So I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but I've heard of some deals going wrong, and I want to touch on that. Where do you see purchases going wrong?
Yeah, it's kind of what I mentioned early on the first question. Usually it's culture. I would say staff maybe unaware of the sale and unwilling to move forward because they're not aligned with the culture or expectations. So you have staff attrition, patient attrition too as well. And that's where it's ideal to kind of know well in advance of what's going to happen, even though you don't have a crystal ball to really know what's going to happen, but get out in front of a lot of those issues.
Right.
And that's why I mentioned the equity role and the structure, mainly the structure. If the structure is right, it kind of helps alleviate some of these things because there's a vested interest on the seller to continue with the success of the business that's being purchased. If there's equity in a line, there's a vested interest potentially, if that's feasible. If they're expected to work there and they forego their contract and give up, is there a penalty in doing so? So there's a lot of things that you can kind of get out in front of and prohibit some of these things. You can't always completely wipe them away, but I'd want to know what all these negative things could be, and I at least have an answer or have a solution. So if it happens, I'm already in front of it. I'm already two steps ahead. And it's also understanding like your team, who's critical on your team to kind of help out with this transition. Like sometimes a lot of doctors will buy a business and just expect for it to operate on its own as it did prior to them buying it. And sometimes you kind of have to integrate things, whether it be practice management softwares, it might be staff, it might be office manager conversations, and it might be shadowing, it might be education. It's kind of important to kind of go through that. And then also, how much is the seller involved? I have mixed opinions on this. It just depends on your situation and their situation. So and we can go through that if you have a conversation, you have a deal at hand, and kind of talk through that. Sometimes it's best just to cut ties and make it a clean break so you can take over and have the team reporting, kind of feeling like they're still reporting to the seller, even though you're the owner. You never kind of want to have that happen. Or at the same time, having them heavily involved may make sense. So, what is that plan? And are you protecting yourself to kind of, as a buyer, to ensure this goes well smoothly for you? And then lastly, buying a business that just drops quickly overnight after purchasing it. You spent a lot of time and effort to have to get that hamster wheel going again versus buying a business and just taking off instantly. You're increasing revenues, you're increasing the EBITDA, you're creating some efficiencies there. That's what you want to do really, really well. Where it goes wrong is when everything spirals out of control and there's no leadership there guiding them forward. So that's kind of the simple, quick version of all that.
Yeah, a lot to consider there. Thanks for sharing that. What
That it is.
the what to watch for, and hey, be prepared, right? And we always want to be. But can you really quickly share one of your success stories? I know you have a pretty big bag to choose from, but what has worked well from you? What can you share that would help our listeners with some takeaways?
Yeah, just trying to. That's a good question, Jamie. And with respect to maybe partnerships, it was a very, I would say, not simple, but turned very complex quickly partnership situation where people wanted to be involved, people didn't want to be involved, associates were involved. It was a lot of work to kind of go through the process. It was a pedo ortho oral surgery actually group that we had worked with and actually had just finalized everything a couple months ago. And they're actually realized very quickly that they have good leadership. All three are very good clinicians that are working towards the same thing. It sounds like they're enjoying the next stage of everything going on
Good.
with a successful change. But they actually realized really quickly, like, hey, we're bigger now than we thought, and we need operational support. Like it was almost evident month one, to kind of go through this. So ironically, had a conversation and brought in our fractional CEO, Aiden, who's now been working with them for about a month to kind of get things going. So a lot of times when you transition to these things, it's a complete change and
Sure.
everyone's ready for it, but there's a missing link, and we kind of we thought this person was going to be right for the operational side of things. Quickly realized their hand was pulled already in 15 different directions. They couldn't actually focus to grow the group in that direction. So brought in Aiden, our fractional CEO, and is actually helping to organize all of that, execute everything, and help take this group forward, which was already a very profitable and good three groups that were coming together. So really excited to kind of see what they're going to do here in 2025 because everything finalized, like I said, towards the end of 2024. And it was a success in my opinion. And they're looking to kind of incorporate new associates and potentially equity models and stuff like that. So it's one of those things, not to sound self-serving for Polaris at all, but it's where we can, like, as you come to certain circumstances, we can get you to the next stage. But if you have another need, like that's the one thing I love about Polaris is that we also have something that can help you out here as needed, as a one-off, if need be. It's not like this is all we do. And once the train is left the dock or whatever, like you we can't help you anymore. No, we can absolutely in some other areas, and that's why a lot of clients reach out to us because they really any stage of that game, there might be a need that we can come in and assist with. So hopefully, I mean, I don't know if that's a true success story, but it's a success story that's probably got a lot more success to come. Yeah.
The biggest success, other than that everyone seems to be happy and, being cohesive at this point, so early in the game, is that they knew themselves well enough to engage with a fractional COO to get things off on the right foot. That to me is
100%.
that they're
Yeah.
successful and they have a plan and they want to stick to it and they know how to engage the best partners. So that's not self-serving. That just they're great at being proactive and getting the right tools in place where they're needed. So, Mark, as always, we appreciate your time and expertise. So, thanks for sharing your insights with our listeners today. What's the best way for our audience to connect with you after this?
Yeah, the best way is probably just to reach out to me directly via email. And my email address is just mark@polarishealthcarepartners.com, at MARK at polarishealthcarepartners.com. Or you could go to our website and submit an inquiry. We get those as well. Everything partnership related or things like that, I get funneled my direction. So really just if you felt like this was helpful or this struck a nerve in a good way, or yes, I've been thinking about this, or I'd like to kind of talk through my specific situation and what that may look like, by all means, give me a call and let's have a conversation more specific to you and your situation. I probably have at least two or three of these a month. We're on the partnership merger aspect consideration. So if not more in some cases. So it's people considering that. I just want to make sure you're making the right decision and you've thought of everything on your end before committing to something for that matter.
Worth a conversation every time.
Absolutely.
Well, there's a lot more to learn about mergers and buy side as you work toward growing your group. And Polaris is obviously here to support your vision. So if you'd like to schedule some time to learn more from Mark or dive into any Polaris expert advisory service, or maybe there's a topic we haven't covered that you want to hear about, you can send us an email to info@polarishealthcarepartners.com, or you can reach us by visiting our website at polarishealthcarepartners.com. Thanks so much for being a loyal listener and subscriber. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you on the next episode of the Group Practice Accelerator Podcast.